You have critics on the left and on the right who say that this approach just can't work. You can't continue to be supportive of one side in a conflict while also trying to end the conflict and create a peace deal. But Trump has shown that actually you can do this, and he's done it in the Middle East, where it's as difficult as it is anywhere on earth. And now the question is going to be whether he can also do this with Ukraine and with Russia. Now, I wanted to say a few things about the nature of the peace in Gaza and indeed the wider settlement that President Trump hopes to be able to achieve between Palestine and Israel. One of President Trump's great successes in his first term was the fact that there were no new wars started. This made him unusual among presidents of the 21st century. In fact, President Trump was the first president of the 21st century under whom we had no new wars. Now, in his second term, President Trump has used military force against Iran, and he has negotiated a peace in the Middle East conflict between Israel and Palestine, in particular the conflict in Gaza. You could say that this is a change from his first term policies, that in fact we have had perhaps a new war with Iran. But if so, this was a war that only lasted about 3 days, and it concluded very successfully with the bombing of Iranian nuclear facilities and certainly the setting back of the Iranian nuclear program by many months or years, and perhaps it has even sent a signal to Iran not to embark on restarting its nuclear program again. So President Trump is not averse to the use of force. He did use it somewhat during his first administration, and he's used it somewhat more during the second term. He also, of course, is a great believer in the power of diplomacy, and he's been doing such exceptional work in that regard that even many of his critics have started to say that President Trump should be considered for the Nobel Peace Prize in the future. Now, his success in negotiating a ceasefire in Gaza came too late for him to be considered for this year's Nobel Peace Prize. But it's surprising just what a wide spectrum of opinion has arisen saying that President Trump should be considered for the Nobel Peace Prize next year. This is even the case where many of his critics, whether in the media or in politics, have said that President Trump has in fact achieved something really remarkable in Gaza and with Israel and Palestine. So you've had British left-wing publications from the BBC to The Guardian writing favorably about President Trump's achievement here. You've had the Washington Post not only publish one of its more conservative columnists who has said that President Trump should get the Nobel Peace Prize, but in fact the Washington Post editorial team has said that if the peace turns out to be lasting, that President Trump and those who helped him negotiate this agreement should all be considered for the award. And Thomas Friedman from the New York Times, who is certainly no friend to conservatives on the whole, has also said that if this works out as well as it seems to be off to a promising beginning, if we see the end wind up being as promising as the beginning here, that Trump should also be considered for the Nobel Peace Prize, in his opinion. So Thomas Friedman, the Washington Post, even political figures like Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton, they haven't exactly said that Trump should be in line for the Nobel Peace Prize, but they've given him a great deal of credit for what he's achieved in Gaza. These are, of course, people who have dedicated their most recent political lives to being anti-Trumps. Hillary Clinton, of course, as Trump's opponent in 2016, Joe Biden as the person who occupied the White House both after and then before President Trump. And so both of them might be expected to be, continuously critical of President Trump no matter what happens. But in fact, even they have conceded that Trump's achievement in getting a ceasefire in Gaza, getting the Israeli hostages returned to Israel, and, putting a framework for peace in place is an achievement that has to be recognized across the political spectrum. Ironically, however, there are some people who are critical of what President Trump has achieved. One certainly would expect the radical left to be, entirely critical no matter what Trump did. No matter, Trump could literally cure cancer, and the radical left would still be very much opposed to him. But also there are people on the right who consider Trump to have, let the conflict go on for too long, and they think that Trump has simply been too deferential to Israel, too supportive of Israel, has provided too much, too many arms and too much money from the American taxpayer to Israel. So even on the right, there are some voices that say that Trump's achievement, in the Middle East is less impressive, or in fact is a mixed blessing and hasn't been quite, as good as even many of Trump's opponents are now conceding. Well, it seems to me that the critics are wrong. Certainly the critics on the hard left are wrong, but the critics on the right are also mistaken. The peace that Trump has been able to work out in Gaza, obviously it's a fragile peace, but nonetheless it is a great achievement. And the promise that it shows for perhaps a more lasting and enduring peaceful relationship between Israel and Palestine, these are achievements that deserve unstinting praise. And they reveal something about Trump's general approach to diplomacy and his general approach to peacemaking. This is going to be important, I think, as we go forward and look at the conflict in Russia and Ukraine, conflict between Russia and Ukraine, where President Trump is going to try to resolve that conflict. And we might get a sense of how he's going to do that based on what he's done with respect to Israel and Palestine. What's notable is that President Trump, while continuing to be very much on the side of Israel, supplying arms and providing funding to Israel, nevertheless, he was not willing to give Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu a blank check or to allow him to do whatever he wanted. Instead, President Trump put pressure on the Israeli Prime Minister, as well as, of course, enormous pressure being put on Palestine, on Gaza, and on the terrorists of Hamas. There were pressure was placed on all sides to bring about an end to the conflict, to bring about negotiations, and to have everyone, both Gaza and also Israel, recognize President Trump as a serious person who has to be, whose words have to be accorded great weight, and who has to be, in some sense, deferred to when he says that a peace deal is going to require certain concessions from both sides. The same approach is the one that President Trump seems to be taking with respect to Ukraine and Russia. So even though the United States continues to support Ukraine, continues to arm Ukraine, to fund Ukraine, and I don't expect that to stop, and I don't expect President Trump to try to stop that, because Trump, in fact, had been supporting Ukraine even during his first term. And of course, he was impeached simply for slowing down and taking a closer look at exactly where that support was going and exactly what was going on with Ukrainian corruption. So even the impeachment of President Trump, the first impeachment during his first term, even that was actually about the fact not that Trump was cutting off Ukraine, but rather that he was trying to be much more careful about how he was going about, how the United States was going about supporting the Ukrainians fighting against the Russians and trying to keep their country intact. So Trump is not likely to back off from support for Ukraine, just as Trump didn't back off from support for Israel. But that doesn't mean that he's not trying to work for peace and a negotiated ceasefire and a negotiated settlement between the belligerents. Now, again, you have critics, on both sides of the political spectrum, on the left and on the right, who say that this approach just can't work. You can't continue to be supportive of one side in a conflict while also trying to end the conflict and create a peace deal. But Trump has shown that actually you can do this, and he's done it in the Middle East, where it's as difficult as it is anywhere on earth. And now the question is going to be whether he can also do this with Ukraine and with Russia. And of course, his strategy here does give him leverage with both sides. It gives him leverage with Ukraine because Ukraine is dependent on American support. And it gives him leverage with Russia because Russia, of course, faces a much tougher opponent in Ukraine because of that support that America is giving to Kyiv. So both sides have good reason to listen to President Trump when he calls for peace. Now, obviously, Russia is a very strong power. It's very much different from, a penny ante murderous group like Hamas. Russia is a country with nuclear weapons. It's a country that has a large population. It has a very large army. So it's a much more difficult task that Trump faces with respect to Russia and Ukraine than he faced in Gaza. Nonetheless, the pattern that he followed in Gaza is something that could apply as well to the Ukraine-Russia conflict. And there's great promise in President Trump's approach. This doesn't mean that, there's no room for people to suggest that there are flaws in this approach, but I do think that those who really almost seem to want conflicts to continue just in order to embarrass President Trump, just in order to show that his approach can't work, I think they are, sort of profoundly perverse and mistaken. And obviously there are people on the left who have that attitude. But again, there are some people on the right who think, if you can't have absolute non-intervention, absolute disengagement from, friends and allies like Israel and Ukraine, that, everything else, should be as disastrous as possible in order to illustrate that having any engagements whatsoever in Europe or in the Middle East are in fact bad and catastrophic for the United States. Well, that is cutting off your nose to spite your face. That is really, kind of wishing for the worst, not only for your own country, but for other nations as well, simply in order to prove a political point. And that's a bad habit to get into, and it's a wicked thing to do. So what Trump is doing may not be perfect according to the strictures of, pure non-interventionist America firsters or libertarians or others. Nevertheless, to the extent that there is a chance for what he's doing to work, everyone should be hoping that that chance pays off. Now, I wanted to say a few things about the nature of the peace in Gaza and indeed the wider settlement that President Trump hopes to be able to achieve between Palestine and Israel. Hi, I'm Dan McCarthy, and if you're enjoying Modern Age with Dan McCarthy, please be sure to hit the like button and follow us on Twitter as well, at Mod Age Journal. We are a publication that's been around since the 1950s, but we're very much, as our title suggests, modern in our mode of thought. We like to make sure that conservatism is not simply nostalgia, but is in fact engaging with the most difficult questions of today, both in the news, but also on a deeper and more philosophical level. You can find Modern Age in print. We are a quarterly publication, but you can also find us on the web, where we have new content every single workday at www.modernAgeJournal.com. And again, we feature some of the most thoughtful conservative essays of today and of the recent past, going back all the way to the 1950s. On modernAgeJournal.com, where every weekday you will find a new article posted. A fundamental problem that Palestine faces, and that any attempt to create a so-called two-state solution to the conflict between Israel and Palestine also faces, is that it's very difficult to imagine geographically exactly what a viable Palestinian state would look like. So for the most part, you have two different blocks of Palestinians who are geographically separated, who have, the state of Israel in the middle between these two populations. You have on the one hand the population of Gaza, and then the population of the West Bank. And in general, you have Palestinian settlements interspersed among Israeli territory and within Israeli territory. And as a result, you wind up with, a population whose distribution does not resemble the distribution of a nation's population on anywhere else on Earth or on any map that we can look at. There's no country on Earth that is, consists of a series of detached enclaves and exclaves that then may have corridors leading, to one another. For the most part, nation states have to be contiguous. Nation states have to be concentrated. And if you're a large enough and powerful enough country, yes, you can have exclaves and, other far-flung possessions. In the case of the United States, of course, Hawaii and Alaska are two states that are not part of the lower 48, the contiguous continental United States. And of course, we have a number of territories as well. But of course, the United States has enough military power, enough economic might, enough sway within the world that it can defend these territories, and they're kept safe from any degree of intimidation or outright attack by foreign powers. When it comes to Palestine, it's just very difficult to imagine what a map is going to look like that will create a sufficiently contiguous Palestinian state that it would be viable. And of course, a state not only needs generally to be contiguous, but it needs to have a certain amount of cultural cohesion. It needs to have an identity that's not simply based on being anti-Israel or opponents of some other country. It also needs to have military power and economic wealth. And of course, economic wealth is a component of military power. You need to have a sufficiently robust economy that you can actually create an armed forces that is able to, stand on its own 2 feet. None of these conditions applies to Palestine. Palestine doesn't have much military power. It doesn't have a very strong economy, and it doesn't have contiguous territory. Even the question of the degree to which there is a kind of national cohesion psychologically among the Palestinians is open to question. Now, there's certainly a great deal in common that the Palestinians have, but there are also very strict differences as well. So there are differences of religion, for example, that are quite notable between Muslim Palestinians and Christian Palestinians. And there are other divides of various kinds as well. This makes the idea of a two-state solution and a Palestinian state very hard to imagine. It seems that you could potentially get a kind of pseudo-state in Palestine, but a pseudo-state, something that would be notionally or nominally called a Palestinian state, but that really wouldn't have the characteristics that we expect of successful nation-states in the world. This kind of fake or pseudo-Palestinian state could be created by regional powers. It could be that you have the Arab and Muslim states nearby and Israel itself sponsoring a kind of Palestinian state and government. And I can see that that would be precisely what the regional powers would like to have happen. And it makes logical sense. If you have a population that is unable, both geographically and in every other respect, to create a viable nation state for itself, if it's not going to be absorbed into some other existing state, if it is going to have some sort of notional nation of its own, it's going to have to be a nation that basically is not one that they have won for themselves, but rather one that is created for them by other powers. Now, given that, clearly the Palestinians have a choice to make. They have a choice to make between, on the one hand, rejecting foreign influence, even if that foreign influence is setting up a Palestinian state of sorts, even if that foreign influence is coming not only from Israel, but also from the Arab and Islamic world, and also perhaps to some extent from Europe. That's one choice. They can reject all of that, or they can accept it. If they reject it, then they're probably left with what they have right now, which is a state of misrule by a variety of authorities, including, unfortunately, in Gaza, Hamas. And over time, it's very difficult to see that Palestinian conditions will improve rather than continue to deteriorate, or that Palestine will ever generate a successful leadership of its own. So the idea of rejecting this kind of foreign overlordship that would create a protectorate state is, I think, a suicidal one on the part of Palestine. The logical thing to do is to accept this foreign influence and accept the creation of a Palestinian state, which will certainly be largely overseen. Its military power, its economic power, its political cohesion, all these things will have to be guaranteed by other regional powers, by neighbors. And of course, the most important neighbor there is Israel itself. So as much as there is certainly bad blood between Israel and Palestine, Israel is absolutely indispensable to the future of a stable Palestine. Now, what I'm describing is actually very similar to the conditions that prevail under empires, that traditionally, and this is especially true of the Palestinians and their territory, these peoples have lived under imperial overlordship, including before the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. It was the Ottoman Turks who were providing the overall governance structure of these territories and these populations. It's a typical thing in human history that we tend to forget as Westerners is in fact more the norm than our nation states are. But empires are very much a tradition across the world, and empires involve, basically rule by foreigners or foreigners that have overlordship over a locality. And that seems to be the destiny that Palestine in its current configuration is looking at. And of course, President Trump is trying to create a multinational board, including many Europeans and Americans, who are going to try to oversee the early stages of reconstruction. Ultimately, I think, this board will have to hand off responsibility for what's happening in Palestine to local entities, neighbors, to the Arab and Islamic neighbors and to Israel. But at the beginning here, there does seem to be a role that Trump is envisioning for Europeans to help stabilize things and for Americans too. And of course, former British Prime Minister Tony Blair is a person that President Trump has designated as a kind of viceroy, so to speak, for Palestine. And we'll see how that works out. Tony Blair is very eager to redeem himself after the way his prime ministership concluded in the UK. So Tony Blair was prime minister for about 10 years. He was very successful in winning elections. He was, however, something like the British version of George W. Bush. He got his country, he was an ally to George W. Bush. He got his country into the Iraq War. And the British, even more than Americans, have a great deal of regret about that war and a great deal of regret about the fact that it led to, ongoing occupation without any kind of really positive resolution. So Tony Blair has had a shadow over his reputation ever since he stepped down as prime minister. And as a result, he's going to have, a great impetus to redeem himself and to try to do his best in whatever role he plays in rebuilding Palestine. That said, given Tony Blair's track record and given the way things worked out with his leadership in Britain, one has reason to be skeptical. And, I've said that it would make most sense for the Palestinians to accept the degree of foreign overlordship or, foreign proprietorship even of their, territory and their lives in order to have peace and harmony. But of course, there's necessarily going to be a tension where Palestinians are going to want some degree of democracy. Even if they accept foreign overlordship, they're going to want to have foreigners who are respectful of the Palestinians themselves and who, defer to them in whatever, ways are viable and whatever ways do not cause violence and disruption and do not give Hamas a chance to reclaim power. So there's going to have to be a balance between, on the one hand, foreign overlordship and actual Palestinian representation and the feeling of the Palestinians that even if their political structures are underwritten by a foreign power, nonetheless, they still are invested in these structures themselves. And while this may seem like a very, very tall order, and indeed it is, not only is there, are there examples from imperial histories of this working out successfully, whether we talk about the Ottoman Empire or the Austro-Hungarian Empire or any number of others, but even in a sense, within nation states, you often see this to be the case. So nation states do indeed often have religious or ethnic minorities. They can also have political minorities, and there can be, a great deal of tension between a political ruling class and the people. And to a greater or lesser extent, you actually see this today all across the world, including in the West, including in the United States. So the challenge of getting a population who is being ruled to feel invested in the Constitution, to feel invested in their rulers, even if their rulers seem like a separate class from themselves. In a sense, this is a challenge that all states face, all nations. And so even the Palestinians are not necessarily alone in the challenge of trying to create a harmony between the leadership on the one hand and the people on the other, even though in Palestine it may indeed be very much a foreign element, which is either providing leadership up front or that is providing the necessary support for local leaders. Now, there is another alternative that's much more, dramatic, and that I don't expect Palestinians even to consider. But because the geographic problem that Palestine presents is so insuperable, the alternative to trying to create a state out of this kind of Swiss cheese confederacy would be to move the population out of many of the places where it already is and concentrate it instead in a much smaller contiguous territory, and to try to create a contiguous territory that would be smaller than Palestine currently is, which is already quite tiny, but something that would be perhaps, if not a city-state, a kind of city-state plus, an expanded territory that nonetheless is quite compact and that has, the entirety of the population within its reaches. The point of this would be to create something that actually does have more of the character of a state. And of course, historically, states begin as city-states. History has, great examples of city-states like those of ancient Greece, long before we have examples of nation-states like those of the 21st century. So you could create a much more compact kind of Palestinian state that would have, potentially defensible borders, that would have, pressures to create a kind of cohesive identity, a sense of neighborliness within itself, and that could potentially, over time, become quite prosperous economically. Certainly, city-state scale entities in the world today, including states like Singapore, they're very small geographically, and yet they are very wealthy and very successful. Now, Palestine Palestine would have a very long way to go before it could reach that stage, and it might never become as successful as Singapore. But, Singapore actually started out, in a fairly rough condition itself. Singapore has deep ethnic divisions. A lot of the wealth and political power is held by a Chinese ethnic minority within Singapore. Singapore did not start out as a wealthy state, but it had a great singular leader, Lee Kuan Yew, who was able to transform Singapore from a sort of backwater colonial possession under the British and, something that was overshadowed by, its neighbors who had, generally more of a Muslim kind of state. The Singaporeans under Lee Kuan Yew were able to create a modern, successful, actually quite diverse state, which has, ethnic diversity and religious diversity, and yet it's politically quite unified. It's economically tremendously successful. It's also militarily respectable. It's not a country that's large enough to win a war with a larger state, but it certainly is large enough that it can sting any kind of larger state that tries to bully it. It has, formed a very close security relationship with the United States. And so Singapore is a great model of success when it comes to having a small territory, which on the face of it would seem like it's doomed to poverty and division. But in fact, with singular leadership like someone of the nature of Lee Kuan Yew, it has been one of the world's great successful microstates. I don't expect that to happen in Palestine. I don't think it's even imaginable. I don't think there is a leader like Lee Kuan Yew for Palestine, and I also don't think that the Palestinians themselves, given that so much of their self-identity now is wrapped up in the idea of defending ancestral territories, that they would be willing to give up the footprint they currently have, even though it's divided within Israeli territory. I don't think they'd be willing to give that up in order to concentrate their population in a smaller territory that would nonetheless have more of the characteristics of a city-state or a successful microstate. By the way, it's worth noting as well that Israel itself is a great example of creating a modern state out of conditions that otherwise seemed extremely unfavorable to such political success. So in the 19th century, Jews were largely a diaspora. There was a very small number of Jews in the Holy Land itself. The Holy Land goes from being controlled by the Ottoman Empire and a series of earlier Islamic empires to being under the protection of the British, and ultimately the British and the French and some others as well. But European overlordship. And the idea of creating a Jewish state in the Middle East was quite shocking, and it really did require an enormous amount of organizing on the part of people who were not in the Middle East itself, who were not in the Holy Land. Zionism was a Jewish political movement, largely in Europe, to some extent in the United States and elsewhere, and it created a modern state. It involved literally uprooting from Europe, having Jews move to the Holy Land, and reestablish a new modern state on the basis of the older biblical Israel. This is a tremendous feat that, again, it required a lot of sacrifice, and it involved an enormous amount of risk. You had people who, might have been prosperous in various parts of the world deciding to uproot themselves and move to a territory where they were going to be surrounded by neighbors of a different ethnicity, neighbors of a different religion, Arabs and Muslims. There was the potential for hostility and, in fact, the reality of hostility. And, it was moving to the Holy Land was not moving to a place of great prosperity or that seemed as if it would be entirely ideal from a kind of abstract perspective about having a wealthy and militarily powerful, geographically defensible state. And yet a tremendous amount of political will went into the project of creating modern Israel, and it succeeded. The success of modern Israel is a great example to other peoples around the world. And I think it's a great mistake that so many peoples think only in terms of ancient historical geographic possessions or possessions that they may have right now. And the idea, because you could imagine a different kind of mentality among 19th century Zionists and 20th century Zionists, where they thought, well, the Holy Land would just be too difficult to, turn into a modern state. We should simply, stay where we are, enjoy, the benefits of, being part of a wider Western civilization, or potentially, you could have taken other, perhaps less populated parts of the world as a good place to start a new nation state. And of course, so much of Western history involves precisely that. It involves English colonists, for example, coming to the New World and creating what ultimately becomes the United States. But while there certainly was an interest in the biblical importance of Israel, it was not territory in which the Zionists were already living. Similarly, other peoples today should think about whether the territories they currently occupy really are things that they can defend or turn into successful nation states, or if not, then reconcentrating in different places would make sense. And again, that I think would be a logical thing to happen for the Palestinians, to create a much more compact, and somewhat viable, cohesive state. But again, that seems to be off the table. I don't expect that to happen. There's no Lee Kuan Yew for the Palestinian territories. And as a result, a kind of quasi-imperial foreign overlordship is the most likely outcome. And it's one that can be accepted, I think, with a glad heart. It's not something that has to be seen as foreign oppression. It's simply the case that not every population in its current geographic configuration is able to create a viable, successful nation state. Of course, the other alternative that's been considered, including by some Israelis, is ultimately a one-state solution, which would involve Israel first taking responsibility for the population of Palestine, and then ultimately integrating that population into Israel itself. But obviously that involves a tremendous amount of resistance, both from Israelis who have good reason to fear what will happen politically if a large, non-Israeli population, non-Jewish population is integrated into Israel, but also on the part of the Palestinians who believe, they are a distinct people who should have a distinct, political unit of some kind of their own, and they should not simply be a minority, and a minority perhaps with second-class rights within a larger state such as Israel. And, I think that if there were any kind of one-state solution, it would have to begin not with the Palestinians having the full rights that currently Arab Israelis enjoy. There are Arab Israelis, and they do indeed enjoy a wide variety of civic rights. But it seems to me that because the Palestinians are becoming from a much more deprived and troubled set of conditions, that they would likely be, kind of probationary citizens at first. So that, too, is an extremely difficult scenario to imagine or to have work out in a practical way. President Trump is not going to try to, solve the region's problems forevermore. What he is going to do, however, is to create conditions in which the local regional powers, that includes Israel, but that includes also Arab and Muslim states such as Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states and others, are going to have be able to work with the Palestinians in a peaceful way and try to create something that will secure Palestine, provide government, provide law enforcement, keep terrorists like Hamas out of power, while at the same time, even if it's not viable to create a truly compact and contiguous Palestinian state, you will at least get a territory that is well ruled, well governed, and that the Palestinians themselves will feel is just and is something in which they have a tremendous investment. So there are no easy solutions when you have these kinds of territorial conflicts between peoples who are different in religion, different in ethnicity. Nevertheless, the world has many examples of success of mitigating these conflicts, whether under imperial conditions or under conditions of various more modern configurations. And President Trump's role is simply he's creating conditions that will allow the local, both the Palestinian population, the Israeli population, and regional neighbors to try to work things out for themselves in conditions of greater peace and stability. So President Trump has indeed done something, I think, that it's absolutely remarkable. The fact that he is getting praise from beyond his own party, even from the likes of Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, is really an indication of just how historic this achievement is. So we'll see what the Nobel Prize Committee thinks in 2026.